Today we will explore one of the greatest feats of human engineering before the industrial era, the construction of medieval castles. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this. Medieval Europe was a place of uncertainties. Wars, invasions, and territorial disputes marked the daily life of kings, nobles, and peasants. In the midst of this turbulent scenario, raising a stone fortress represented much more than a demonstration of power. It was a matter of survival, and building a castle was not like assembling a simple wooden structure. There was no room for error. A single mistake did not result in a crooked wall, but in tons of stone collapsing on the workers. Kings and feudal lords learned this lesson the hard way, usually right after someone confidently declared that a certain section would hold the weight. The journey of building a castle began long before the first stone was cut. Everything started with a crucial decision that could determine the success or failure of the entire undertaking: the choice of location. Medieval kings were true property experts, although their concerns were radically different from those we have today. When it came to selecting the perfect terrain for a fortress, they were playing a deadly game of territorial strategy, where a miscalculation could cost much more than money. It could cost the entire kingdom. A monarch could not simply point to a map and decide where his castle would be raised. The location needed to offer security, ensure a constant supply, and project power over the region. It was necessary to consider multiple factors simultaneously, evaluating each advantage and disadvantage of the terrain with almost scientific precision. Elevated terrain was the medieval equivalent of a luxury penthouse. From the top of a hill or mountain, it was possible to spot enemies approaching from kilometers away, providing valuable time to prepare defenses. Furthermore, attacking a position on elevated ground was extremely exhausting. Imagine trying to run uphill carrying heavy weapons and armor under the scorching sun or torrential rain, while defenders launch projectiles from above. The tactical advantage was undeniable. Water sources also figured among the main concerns of medieval builders. Rivers and lakes did not serve only to keep the inhabitants hydrated, although that was evidently important. Watercourses functioned as natural moats, creating barriers that made any assault attempt enormously difficult. Additionally, they provided fresh water for drinking, cooking, and maintaining the castle's hygiene. Recent archaeological studies revealed that some castles possessed ingenious water management systems, including underground cisterns capable of storing enough water to sustain hundreds of people for months during a siege situation. Proximity to main roads and trade routes was also fundamental. It was like having the castle positioned next to a medieval highway. Supplies needed to arrive regularly: food, weapons, building materials, and all the other items necessary to keep a fortress running. Similarly to the development of modern cities around important transport routes, medieval castles grew and prospered when well connected to the trade routes of the time. Sometimes the perfect location for a castle was already inhabited. Historical records show that some medieval kings relocated entire communities of up to 1,000 people just to build their fortresses. It was an extreme and ruthless version of territorial expropriation. And there were even more extraordinary cases. Some monarchs ordered the moving of entire churches. Explaining this decision to the Pope certainly required considerable diplomatic skills. The process of securing the ideal location did not involve only physical aspects of the terrain. Kings needed to navigate a complex web of politics, property rights, and feudal obligations. One wrong move could trigger a war or provoke a peasant revolt. There are documented cases of castle construction projects abandoned halfway through due to political disputes that made the work unfeasible. The most perceptive kings also chose locations with symbolic significance. Building a castle on the site of an old battle or on ground considered sacred functioned as a powerful medieval propaganda tool. It conveyed a clear message about power and legitimacy. Some castles were raised in locations associated with local legends or myths, adding an extra layer of supernatural intimidation to the already imposing presence of the fortress. Some locations were chosen based on astronomical alignments. Certain medieval builders positioned their fortresses so that the sun would shine directly through specific windows on important dates, such as the king's birthday or religious festivals. With the site finally defined, the real challenge was just beginning. Now it was necessary to gather all the materials needed to raise this massive stone fortress. And when we talk about gathering materials for a medieval castle, we are describing a logistical nightmare that would make modern construction projects look like child's play. Imagine trying to move thousands of tons of stone without trucks, cranes, or proper roads. The amount of stone needed just for the foundation of a typical castle could fill approximately 50 modern Olympic swimming pools. And that was only the beginning of the material collection adventure. A medium-sized castle needed approximately 12,000 tons of stone. To put it in perspective, that is equivalent to the weight of about 2,000 adult elephants. The largest castles could consume up to 50,000 tons of rock. Recent archaeological studies demonstrated that some of the larger castles in Wales used individual stone blocks weighing up to 1.5 tons each. That is heavier than a modern automobile. The builders created temporary wooden roads specifically designed to support the immense weight of the stone blocks. These roads were ingeniously constructed with thick wooden planks, which needed to be regularly replaced as they wore down under the constant weight of the loads. It was a medieval version of road maintenance. The transport itself was a spectacle in its own right. Oxen were the trucks of the time, although much slower and with difficult temperaments. A team of oxen could pull about 2 tons of stone at a time, moving at 3 kilometers per hour. At this rate, if the quarry were 15 kilometers away, a round trip consumed an entire day. Records from one castle construction show that 200 oxen working continuously for 3 years were needed just to transport all the necessary stone. Shrewder builders took advantage of rivers when possible. Transporting stone downriver on barges was faster and easier than land transport. But stone was not the only indispensable material. Wood was equally crucial and in impressive quantities. It would be used for scaffolding, roofs, doors, and temporary structures throughout the construction. Records from one castle show the use of more than 3,000 trees just for the scaffolding. Medieval deforestation was so severe that some areas of England still have not completely recovered their forests 800 years later. The wood situation became so critical in some regions that special laws were created to regulate the cutting of trees. Some kings declared entire forests as exclusive property, reserved only for castle builders. There was also the issue of specialized labor. Master masons were like the celebrities of the medieval construction world. Kings literally vied with each other for the best builders, offering them special privileges and generous salaries. Some masons became so famous that they could demand extraordinary perks. A master mason supposedly insisted on being paid partially in wine, specifying exactly from which vineyards the drink should come. The total workforce was massive. Historical records indicate that some castle constructions employed more than 1,000 workers during periods of intense activity. There were specialized stone cutters, carpenters, blacksmiths, and general manual laborers. Each group had its own guild rules, pay scales, and working conditions. The unsung heroes of castle construction included the rope makers. A large castle project could consume several kilometers of rope to lift stones and operate pulleys. The records of one castle show that in a single year enough rope was used to stretch from London to Paris. Iron was also essential. Tons of it were needed for tools, nails, hinges, and other metalwork. A large castle could consume up to 50 tons of iron. With the materials finally gathered, the time came for the next phase, laying the foundations. Medieval builders excavated until they hit solid rock, which sometimes meant going down more than 12 meters below ground level. That is deeper than the height of a 3-story building. Archaeological studies of castle ruins revealed that some foundations went even deeper. A castle in Wales had foundations that reached 20 meters below the surface. The foundation trenches were not filled with ordinary stone. The builders used a medieval version of concrete called mortar, a mixture of lime, sand, and water. But sometimes they became creative with the recipe. Some builders added animal blood to the mortar mixture because they believed it made it stronger. Others added egg whites, hair, and even beer. Here is where medieval engineering becomes truly impressive. These builders created what we today call stepped foundations. These looked like inverted underground pyramids, widening as they descended toward the base. This design distributed the castle's weight more evenly and provided greater stability. A particularly notable example discovered in Scotland had 7 distinct steps, each perfectly leveled. All this was accomplished without modern surveying equipment. The size of these foundations was incomprehensible. A typical castle foundation could be up to 9 meters thick. That is wider than many entire modern houses. The builders created a rubble core by filling the middle with smaller stones and debris, then surrounding everything with carefully cut stones on the outside. Recent studies demonstrated that this rubble core technique was so effective that it helped some castles survive earthquakes that devastated nearby buildings. Temperature was a huge concern during the laying of foundations. If it was too hot, the mortar would dry too fast and crack. If it was too cold, it would not harden properly. Medieval records show that builders worked at night during summer heat waves and covered fresh mortar with straw in winter to protect it from frost. One of the most impressive foundation techniques was called continuous pouring. Workers operated non-stop in shifts to ensure the foundation was laid in a single continuous piece. This meant organizing hundreds of workers into rotating teams. Historical records of a castle construction describe workers passing stones from hand to hand in human chains that stretched for hundreds of meters. They even had special whistles and drums to coordinate the workers. The most impressive part is that many of these foundations are still fulfilling their role today, centuries later. Modern engineers have studied them and discovered that some medieval foundation techniques were so effective that we still use similar methods today. A castle foundation in Germany was so well built that modern builders decided to erect a new building directly on top of it. With all this underground work completed, it was time to start on the walls. Medieval castle walls were no ordinary walls. Built on those massive foundations, these walls had to withstand everything from battering rams to trebuchet attacks. Walls of large castles typically were between 9 and 13 meters high, taller than a 4-story building. The truly impressive ones reached up to 24 meters, and they were not thin structures. Some walls were 6 meters thick at the base. It was literally possible to build a small apartment inside them. The actual construction process was like a medieval version of a layer cake. Each layer had its specific purpose. The outer faces used carefully cut stones that fit together like puzzle pieces. Precisely cut stones made the wall stronger and harder to climb. Recent archaeological studies showed that some master masons could cut stones so precisely that even today one cannot pass a credit card between them. Behind these elegant stones came a layer of rougher rocks, and in the middle was the core. The core of the walls was filled with a mixture called rubble infill. They poured in smaller stones, chips left over from cutting the large blocks, and mixed everything with mortar. The records of one castle show that they even threw in old tools, broken pottery, and once, accidentally, someone's lunch. Raising these massive stones required clever engineering. They used wooden cranes called tread wheels, basically giant medieval elevators, powered by people walking inside huge wheels, like hamsters in cages. These tread wheels could lift stones weighing up to 2 tons, the weight of a modern car. The walls were not built simply straight up. Most castle walls were built with a slight slant, wider at the base and narrower at the top. The slant made the wall stronger and helped deflect projectiles. Tests showed that stones dropped from the top bounced consistently at the perfect angle to hit attackers down below. Many castle walls still show mason marks, personal signatures carved by the workers who built them. Masons used these marks to prove which stones they had laid so they could receive payment. Archaeologists catalogued more than 1,200 different mason marks in a single castle, each unique. The walls also included some clever defensive features. They built arrow slits, narrow gaps through which archers could shoot while remaining protected. These gaps were wider on the inside than on the outside. This meant that the defenders could shoot at different angles while presenting a tiny target to the attackers. Tests with modern replicas showed that a medieval archer could cover about 70 degrees of arc through a single arrow slit. The real stars of medieval castle defense were the towers and gatehouses. Towers were not just for show, they were serious defense business. Round towers became the most popular design. Tests on surviving castle ruins showed that round towers were 50% more likely to survive bombardments than square ones. Additionally, there were no corners for attackers to hide in. Tower walls were often thicker than regular castle walls, sometimes reaching 6 meters in thickness. Archaeologists in a Welsh castle discovered that the walls of its main tower contained more than 3,000 tons of stone. The builders built the towers in stages, letting each level settle before adding the next. One tower took 3 years just to settle properly before they could finish it. They built into the towers spiral staircases that always turned clockwise going up. It was a clever defensive feature. Most people were right-handed, so attackers going up the stairs would have their sword hand against the central wall, giving them less space to strike. Meanwhile, defenders coming down could swing freely with their right hand. Records show a castle where 20 attackers were held back by only 3 defenders thanks to this staircase design. Some steps were deliberately built at different heights. Medieval trip traps. Defenders knew exactly where these irregular steps were, but attackers would trip and fall. One castle even had a step nicknamed the Breaker because it was taller than all the others. The gatehouse was the most heavily defended part of the castle. Historical records show that about 70% of castle attacks focused on the gatehouse. The builders took this threat so seriously that some gatehouses were actually larger than the main quarters of the castle. The gatehouse had more defensive features than a modern bank vault. First, there was the drawbridge. Modern reconstructions showed that a typical drawbridge could be raised in less than 30 seconds. Then came the portcullis, a heavy metal grate that lowered like a medieval security curtain. Most gatehouses had 2 portcullises, with the space between them called the death zone. Records from one castle showed that defenders could trap attackers in this space. The murder holes in the ceiling allowed defenders to drop all sorts of nasty things on the attackers. Historical documents list some creative ammunition: stones, arrows, hot sand, boiling water, beehives, lime powder, and even kitchen scraps. The records of one castle mention a particularly successful defense where they dropped a beehive on attackers, creating instant chaos. The towers also housed watchmen. These guys had the highest office in the medieval world, sometimes more than 30 meters above ground. They used a complex system of horns and bells to signal different types of threats. One castle had 12 different horn signals. Tests on reconstructed towers showed that watchmen could spot approaching armies up to 8 kilometers away in good weather. If all else failed and enemies got past the walls, towers, and gatehouse, the keep was where everyone ran to hide. It was the ultimate castle panic room. The walls of the keep made the regular castle walls look like paper. We are talking about walls up to 12 meters thick at the base. Archaeological studies showed that some keeps could survive impacts from trebuchets throwing stones as heavy as a small car. One famous keep received 163 direct hits during a siege and was barely scratched. The entrance to the keep was usually on the 2nd floor, not the ground floor. It was necessary to climb a wooden ladder to enter, and this ladder could be pulled up or burned if enemies got too close. Records of a siege tell of attackers who finally invaded the castle, only to find themselves looking at the keep's entrance 6 meters above their heads. The interior of the keep had tiny windows, more like arrow slits with attitude. Tests on reconstructed keeps showed that these windows let in little light. Kings had servants following them with candles during the day. A medieval writer complained that keeps were as dark as a tax collector's heart. Storage was crucial in keeps. They needed to be ready for long sieges. Archaeologists found a keep with storage rooms that could hold enough food for 400 people to survive for 6 months. The wells often went deeper than modern building foundations. The well at Dover Castle went down 120 meters. That is deeper than the height of the Statue of Liberty. Many keeps had hidden escape tunnels called sally ports. These tunnels allowed defenders to escape during a siege to attack the attackers. Archaeological surveys discovered that some keeps had entire networks of these tunnels, sometimes stretching for hundreds of meters. Making the castle habitable was another big challenge. Living in a castle was not exactly like moving into a modern house. Heating a castle was like trying to warm up a cave. Fireplaces were the answer, and medieval builders outdid themselves on them. Castle fireplaces were built on a massive scale. Archaeological studies found fireplaces that could accommodate entire tree trunks. A castle in Scotland had fireplaces so large that a team of servants dragged 5-meter logs every morning. The king's annual firewood bill was higher than the annual salary of some servants. Some builders created a primitive version of central heating. They built hollow spaces in the walls, where hot air from the fireplaces could travel through the castle. Recent studies of castle ruins found these heating channels in several high-status quarters. Analysis shows that these systems could raise the temperature of the rooms by about 5 degrees. Water systems were another headache. Records show that some castles employed water boys whose only job was to carry buckets up and down stairs all day. Studies estimate that a typical castle needed about 2,000 liters of water per day for basic operations. Lighting was another challenge. Without electricity, castle residents relied on a mixture of natural light through tiny windows and artificial light from candles and oil lamps. Castle records show impressive numbers of candles being used. One castle spent 8,000 candles in a single month. Glass windows were an extreme luxury. When they appeared, they were so valuable that some nobles took them with them when they traveled between castles. A castle is only as good as the people who defend it. A medium-sized castle typically needed about 100 soldiers for basic defense. During times of war, this number could jump to more than 500. Archaeological evidence from one castle showed that the soldiers' quarters were so cramped that each man had approximately as much personal space as a modern coat closet. The training was constant. Archers practiced every day. Medieval laws required all men to practice archery on Sundays. Tests with recovered medieval longbows show that they required up to 70 kilos of force to pull. Skeletal remains of medieval archers show that they developed asymmetrical bones from years of practice. Their right arms were often 50% larger than their left ones. Food during a siege was a challenge. Calculations based on medieval records show that feeding 500 defenders required about 400 kilos of food per day. Studies of castle storage rooms showed that they could store enough preserved food to feed the entire garrison for up to 6 months. One castle survived a year-long siege by rationing food so strictly that even the lord had to eat the same portions as ordinary soldiers. Sleep was a luxury during wartime. Guards worked in 4-hour shifts, and records show they had some creative ways of staying awake. One castle gave its night watchmen special spiced wine that supposedly kept them alert. Being caught sleeping on duty was serious business. One castle's rules stated that guards who slept would have to spend the next day wearing their chainmail backwards. The most impressive part of castle defense was the coordination. Different groups had to work together like a medieval special force. Castle records include detailed defensive manuals. One had 50 pages and included 20 different trumpet signals for various commands. A successful siege typically lasted between 6 and 8 months. The longest recorded siege of a medieval castle lasted 21 years. All these defenses worked very well until someone invented gunpowder. Tests on castle walls showed that primitive cannon fire could cause more damage in an hour than traditional siege equipment could cause in a week. Suddenly, those thick stone walls were no longer so impressive. Gunpowder forever altered the equation of military power. Fortresses that had stood for centuries became vulnerable in a matter of hours. Medieval castles remain to this day as impressive testimonies of human ingenuity. Each stone placed, each secret passage dug, each tower raised tells the story of thousands of workers, craftsmen, and engineers who dedicated their lives to these monumental constructions. From the deep foundations that still support many of these structures to the towers that still dominate European landscapes, medieval castles represent an extraordinary achievement of humanity in an era without modern machines or advanced technology. They remind us that determination, creativity, and hard work can overcome seemingly impossible limitations. If you have come this far in this journey through medieval fortresses, if you felt the oxen dragging tons of stone, if you imagined the workers digging foundations deeper than 3-story buildings, if you understood the ingenuity behind each arrow slit and secret passage, then you understand why these stories deserve to be told. Subscribe to the channel to explore more fascinating narratives like this. Like this video if the construction of medieval castles sparked your admiration for human engineering. And in the comments, tell us which aspect of castle construction impressed you the most. Would it be the stepped foundation technique, the primitive heating systems, or perhaps the elaborate defense mechanisms of the gatehouse? Your participation helps bring more extraordinary stories from the past to you. Until the next historical exploration.